Can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yes,
Okay, great. And are you recording already or did you want to start?
I just started.
Okay, fantastic. All right, thank you very much for the invite to present today. I think it's ironic that 12 months ago... Sorry, Andre? I'll just wait to see if Andre is trying to talk to me or if he's just got his audio unmuted accidentally. All right, he's muted. Fantastic. It seems strange, but 12 months ago, giving a talk or attending a talk and having some discussion seemed a normal part of everyday academic life. But nowadays, it's a small pleasure and it's great to be here today. So thank you again for the invitation. So I will cover a broad reaching range of topics today. If you've seen me talk before, I can't guarantee that you won't have seen any of this, but I can guarantee there'll be substantial parts that you haven't seen. I can do that just through, I guess, basic mathematics of the number of different types of talks we give and the number of talks that people typically attend. So hopefully there's something interesting and fresh for everyone. I'll introduce our group just because I don't think I know everyone in the call. So just give a little bit of a background about where we're coming from, the QT Robotics group. I'll spend the bulk of the talk on the next two topics. So biologically inspired mapping and navigation for robotics and autonomous vehicles, as well as this key question, what happens when the world changes? So how do we make the algorithms and systems that we deploy on our robotic and autonomous systems robust to the fact that the world is ever changing and never staying still? I have a thing on applied research. In this talk, I've actually removed all of the applied research that we do apart from a single summary slide. Part of my selfish motivation here is hopefully to get an invite back to give another more specific talk, maybe in 6 months or 12 months time, or maybe one of my postdocs or PhD students. So I come from the QUT Robotics group. We have a center called the QUT Center for Robotics, but we also have a number of other large industrial training centers and manufacturing hubs at QUT. We have over 100 active researchers in all things robotics and the AI and other technologies that underlie robotics. And we are involved in pretty much all robots and autonomous systems in pretty much every domain. So anything that flies, anything that operates on or underneath the surface of the water, robots on farms, in surgical theaters, in medical contexts, as other medical contexts on the roads. Pretty much if it moves, we're trying to automate or semi-automate it and develop new research and technology in the process of doing so. If you want more information, look us up online. There's lots of good online, high-level sort of, not so much for this audience, but layperson references that are available. And of course, there's lots of papers. In particular, we've been doing a lot of survey and opinion papers over the last few years, which are a lot of fun, but they're also a great chance to sort of expand on the bigger picture issues that we think are important that you don't always necessarily see in a typical standalone research paper. So if you want to get a sort of more substantial intellectual read, look up some of our survey and opinion papers. We release most of our code. So there's open source code for a lot of the stuff you'll see today. The quality of this open source code varies from highly polished to research quality code, but you can always get in contact with us if you find a bug or can't get something to work. So onto the main part of the talk, really to motivate where my group and my personal interests have been. I'm really interested in understanding artificial and natural intelligence. So natural intelligence in terms of animals, insects, and humans, but also artificial intelligence. So how can we learn how to create highly capable AI systems? And because that is a very daunting task, the way we approach that problem is to look at a really concrete and tangible aspect of intelligence, and that's spatial intelligence. So this is things like mapping, like an understanding of the world around us, and navigation. Spatial intelligence is a very tangible process. You can observe it in the brain, you can measure it behaviorally in animals and insects. So we think of it as a great way, a great ticket sort of access point to understanding this bigger picture problem of just general intelligence. Our research philosophy is sort of a circular one. So we're motivated by the problems that our industry and government partners come to us with, but we're also motivated, like everyone else, by fundamental scientific curiosity. One of the few remaining pleasures of being in academia is you can pursue things sometimes out of scientific curiosity, which is fantastic. We do a lot of modeling, not always, but a lot of modeling of what we know or what our esteemed collaborators know about what happens in the natural kingdom, what happens with animals, with humans, and how do they perform the tasks that they do effortlessly every day. We also model a lot of the understanding of how neural circuits in the brain work, particularly in areas of spatial navigation and in areas of visual perception, are two of the areas we've particularly done a lot of modeling. We do neural networks of all varieties, traditional neural networks, which will be familiar and comfortable for people who sort of grew up in the 80s and 90s during neural networks, but also, of course, modern deep learning architectures as well, and sometimes the two of them together. We put these systems on robots. They typically fail catastrophically, and that's where 90% of the work occurs. We try and make these systems work. Some of this can be done with further insights from our biology or neuroscientist collaborators. Some of it we have to engineer and fill in the gaps based on a good sort of intuition about engineering and what should happen in these systems. And eventually you hopefully get a system that either satisfies or scratches that intellectual interest in the first place and is maybe useful for your government or industry partner. And in doing so, if everything lines up nicely, you learn all sorts of fundamental things about these processes that you can feed back to the biologists, the neuroscientists, the machine learners, and the roboticists and engineers. It doesn't always work that way, or it only partly works that way, but that's always our aspiration. So we started, and this project was going before I was even a PhD student, but we started in the mapping and navigation domain in biologically inspired mapping and navigation. So one of the key systems we created was SeqSLAM. So rat for the animal, the rat, SLAM for simultaneous localization and mapping. And there've been some other talks, I think, in this seminar series that have touched on SLAM. But it's basically the process of creating a map of the environment as you move around and keeping track of where you are within that map at the same time. So a large number of people involved in this project over the years, and aspects of this project are still going now, I think nearly 20 years later. So if you compare how a typical robotic or autonomous vehicle mapping system works and how a typical natural system works in terms of mapping, they're very different. So on the left, we have a robot from our lab. It's wandering down a corridor. It's creating a geometric map of the 3D layout of space. So it can detect obstacles, it can detect the free space down the corridor, and so on. And fundamentally, this is the process that most robots and autonomous vehicles use today. If you look at most animal species, they map and navigate and perceive the world in a very different manner to a typical current state-of-the-art robotic mapping system. Most animals likely don't create millimeter precise 3D geometric or 6 degree of freedom geometric maps of the environment. There are some exceptions to that, but it's understood that the representations in the animal and insect brains of the world are fundamentally very different to those that we currently build into robots. Rats are particularly inspiring for roboticists. This is a systems seminar series, so I think the rat as a system is particularly pertinent here. The brown rat has only really become widely distributed around the world with European colonization. So it's only been distributed widely, and I think it's the most widely distributed mammal after humans. It's only become widely distributed in the last many hundreds of years. So that means that the sensors that a rat is equipped with and the neural machinery that it's equipped with in all of these different environments is pretty much the same. And despite the incredible variety of environments, think of a rat in a sewer, a rat in a desert, a rat in a mountainous region, a rat in different levels of urbanized environments, they prosper and flourish extremely well in all of these environments. They do so in a very short lifetime. They only live for a year, maybe 2 years, and they're pretty functional not that long after birth. Contrast this to our robotic system, even to humans, but especially to our robotic systems, which are very specialized systems. They work very well, hopefully, in one very specific task and domain, but they don't have anywhere near this generalizable ability that rats have. We also know a lot about animals like rats. We know that their sense of smell is really good, that they have very good sense of touch through their whiskers, but we know that they can't see very well. And there's a lot of well-documented experimentation that's isolated that even though rat vision is fairly blurry and has relatively low intensity sensitivity or contrast sensitivity, they're capable of doing quite impressive tasks like object recognition at different scales with just their vision, even if you remove the effect of their other senses. So we know that they do that, and we know that they do that with a relatively small brain, at least compared to us. So it's very inspiring. And talking about the brain, we know lots about what happens inside the brain of rats, probably one of the most studied areas of neuroscience. So this is an example of a rat moving around a small square arena. We're looking at it from overhead, and people have superimposed a yellow firing field for that rat. So what that yellow spot is everywhere in that environment that a particular cell called a place cell has fired in the brain. And so it's a very elegant representation of a cell in the brain that forms a very specific task, firing when you're in a certain location or place. There are lots of other cells. So these place cells were sort of first thoroughly discovered in the 70s. They discovered head direction cells, which are effectively firing when the rat's head is in a certain orientation. They discovered those in the 80s. And there've been probably about a half dozen spatially relevant cells found in the brain over the last 30 or 40 years. So it's a very rich, fertile ground for inspiration for roboticists who are trying to create robots that can navigate. So when we started, I started this work during my PhD, so this is really going back a ways, but we'll get to much more recent work at the end of this talk as well. This was our rough reconstruction of all the parts of the brain involved in mapping and navigation to some degree. So we didn't have a lot of money, we didn't have a lot of personnel at the time, so we simplified this to a simple model where we modeled these two types of navigationally relevant cells, place cells and head direction cells, and we had some external sensory input in terms of cameras, as well as encoders on the wheels of our robot, which told us how fast the robot was moving. This is our system. The modeling mechanism we used was a type of network called a continuous attractor network, sometimes CAN, sometimes CANN. These networks have a certain connectivity where there is local excitatory or reinforcing connectivity and very weak global inhibition or negative connections, downweighting connections. And the reason for this particular connectivity is that it gives the network very nice dynamics in terms of if you want to do a sort of crude job of encoding hypotheses or estimates of the location or orientation of a robot in a neural network. So we put this system on a robot. This was our very unambitious initial experiments. Although before this, the biggest experiments that had been done in an 80 centimeter by 80 centimeter arena. So we really upped the ante by going up to, I think, a 2 meter by 2 meter arena. And at this stage, we're using artificial landmarks. You can see those cylinders. And essentially the system broke catastrophically. It could not keep track of where the robot was. It got lost very rapidly. And we were deploying what we thought was a state-of-the-art system. We got some charming reviews from reviewers. I'm sure there's maybe some early career researchers or PhDs in the audience basically saying, oh, you guys are useless. You fail to have any impact in robotics or in neuroscience. So reject, reject, reject. And it was, I guess, a fair call at the time. Brutal, but a fair call. So one of the things we looked at is we formed a thought experiment. We wanted to work out what was going on. And this is the theme of the work we've done for, or at least my group's done for over 15 years, is we look at why things break and then we try and fix them. So this is a thought experiment whereby you have a robot. We're looking down at a corridor-like arena. So imagine you're looking down at an arena from above. There's a corridor indicated by the black lines. And a robot at some stage has moved through that corridor and seen that purple cylinder from two different viewpoints. So it's seen it from the bottom looking upwards, and it's seen it from the right side looking to the left. Over time, what this system would do is it would learn that when it sees a purple cylinder, it could be in one of those two locations, and it could be either facing upwards or to the left. So it has two possible orientation estimates and two possible location estimates whenever it sees that purple cylinder. One of the problems with using these two neural network populations, one that represents place or location and one that represents orientation, is that there's no connectivity. So you don't have any binding of which orientation estimate belongs to which location estimate. And this was, and we could literally watch the dynamics unfolding as we saw the robot moving around. This was the reason why the system repeatedly catastrophically failed. And that's just an animation of that process. And of course, neuroscientists didn't really know much about this at the time, and the roboticists we talked to just went, that's really obvious. Why are you talking to us? So we came up with a system called SeqSLAM. And what we did is we did the functional thing, which is instead of having place cells that represent location and head direction cells that represent orientation, we combined it all into one population of cells called pose cells, where each cell encoded both location and orientation. And so you can see the final SeqSLAM model here. We have this population of pose cells in the blue at the bottom left. The local view cell network is basically just our sensory or perceptual input to the system. And the middle part of the slide is what we call an experience map. Think of this as a graphical readout of the encoding of space, encoded in the pose cells, but laid out in a nice, easily interpretable form. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. What was really nice was, and if you'd been reading the literature more attentively at the time, we would have caught onto this sooner. In 2004 and 2005, neuroscientists discovered a new type of cell called a grid cell, a new type of navigationally relevant cell. And grid cells were like place cells, except one grid cell didn't represent just one location. It represented hundreds or thousands of locations in the environment. So these are square arenas. We're looking at the arena from above, and everywhere that you see a little black dot is where one of these grid cells fired. So you can see it's representing lots of locations now instead of a single one. And not only that, there are different scales of map. So you can see that in this diagram, there's at least 4 different scales of grid maps of the environment. One of the really interesting things about these cells, and also this was what won the Nobel Prize eventually in 2014. So this is a really fundamental discovery in neuroscience. When the Nobel Prize came out, I had a lot of people email me. Half of the people were like, wow, this is amazing. This is so cool. And then I had a bunch of roboticists who said, well, this is obvious. Of course, the system would be built like this. So we learned a lot about different perspectives from different disciplines. Some of the grid cells are really interesting in that they have both locational and orientation properties. So effectively, they had these conjunctive pose properties that we'd speculated might be needed in our early models of SeqSLAM. So it was really cool to see the discovery of a cell, which is by no means the same as the cells we engineered, but had some key properties that we needed for our system to work. So I said briefly before that we had this thing called an experience map, a sort of graphical map of the readout of the layout of space in the environment. So why do we have an experience map? Well, there's a number of reasons. The first of all was if you let loose this mapping system in a complex, large environment over a long period of time, what would happen is that the representation of space as encoded in that pose cell network, the thing with the big red arrow above it, it became increasingly discontinuous over time. So you'd have activity in this neural network jumping around all over the place because of the nature of the physical layout of space and because of the interaction of that layout of space with the sensory input that the robot was receiving. So this visualization on the right is tracking the sort of peak activity level in that network viewed from above over like a 2-hour navigation experiment. And you can see it's a mess. This was actually a map of a building floor, which you'll see later on, but it's very, very discontinuous. So the experience map was a way to read out this very discontinuous representation of space into a nice looking graph map of the space, which I'll show you shortly. The experience map is also useful because at the time, it was very hard to do all sorts of tasks in neural networks directly. So path planning and navigation in a discontinuous representation of space in a neural network was very hard. But if you have a graph representation of the layout of space, it's relatively trivial. And you can see some of the beautiful navigation plots at the bottom left. This is a floor plan of a building, and you can see the robot planning paths based on the shortest path to a goal. You can do other things like map relaxation. This is the animation at the bottom right of the slide, whereby you can distribute spatial errors or spatial discontinuities evenly throughout your entire representation of the environment, which is a method that surveyors, for example, have been using for many, many decades. And finally, at the top right, you can do map pruning. Robots need to have memory management systems just like humans do. And the robots need to be able to proactively forget parts of what they've remembered. And so in the mapping domain, that's especially important for some of our long-term experiments. The robot had to be able to forget. And using this graphical representation, you could deploy all sorts of methods like node pruning methods, for example, to keep your memory requirements stable over long-term mapping and navigation experiments. So what could we do with this system? This is the partly in response to the reviewers continually rejecting us for having no impact in any field. One of the first experiments we really got some attention with was we put this system on a Pioneer robot, which is a state-of-the-art robot back then. We let it wander around the entire floor of our building, quite a large office building floor. It explored for 2 hours autonomously, and then we picked, I think, 5 or 6 locations randomly throughout the floor, which were deemed as mock delivery locations. So the robot would randomly pick one of these locations and navigate to it. And we did this over a period of 1.5 weeks at all times of day and night. So this is including at like 3 a.m. in the morning. That was a fun time in my life. And it made over 1,000 of these delivery trials. It also automatically found its charging station and autonomously recharged itself. So it was pretty much fully self-sufficient. What was particularly notable about this experiment was most robotic mapping systems, you'd take them into a building, you'd map the floor once, and then you'd never touch the map again. It would just become static. This system was continually mapping the environment for its entire duration of the experiment. About a week and a half in, we thought this is going really well. So we took the robot across to a completely separate building, took its charger across as well. We let it start up in this other building. It did another set of navigation trials. We specified some new locations to navigate to. And most importantly, we never told the robot it was in a different building. This was all done pretty much autonomously, apart from the fact we physically moved it there. Finally, we took it back to the first building, started it up again, and it was able to start resuming its navigation trials to the original locations. So all up, this is a video sped up, as in the tradition of all robotic videos, of the robot waking up from its charging station. It's picked a location at the far end of the building, and it's navigating to it. One of the anecdotes about this study was we'd been told we'd be kicked out of this building in a month or two's time, and we'd never get access to it again. So that's a really good way to motivate a researcher to get a lot of research done in a very short period of time. And you can see it going to the other end of the building. So it did this over 1,100 times to all areas of the building across 2 different buildings. And this is the key sort of performance stats. So the pictures at the top left are simply showing that the robot was able to consistently go to the locations it was picking to go to. The graph at the right is the average time it took to do these navigation trials. So you can see it's 60, 80 seconds. And the most important thing is that everything is stable over a long period of time. The memory consumption, the time to navigate was all completely stable over a very long time period. And it traveled, I think, about 40 kilometers in total, which at the time was one of the largest experiments that had ever been run. One of the things that I don't talk a lot about, but given the audience we have today, is behavior was key for this experiment. So a lot of work in mapping and SLAM is focused on the mapping systems, but really just as important are the behavioral systems that enable the robot to move around in the environment, not to get stuck. And it's not just a case of collision avoidance, which is what most people think of initially. The nature of the movement behaviors of the robot inherently shape the nature of the mapping and navigation systems you put on them. And you see this in the animal kingdom all the time. The mapping systems that they develop are fundamentally shaped by the nature of the motion of that animal and how it moves through its local environment. And they're really sort of connected functionalities. The other experiment we did was we got given some MacBook Pros. We didn't have anything to do with them, so we strapped them to the roof of my car and we drove 66 kilometers around the suburb of my former university, University of Queensland, and ran RATSLAM. We use very simple vision methods. So this is a vision method where we sum the intensities of the image pixels to form intensity profiles. We estimate the vehicle's speed by how much these profiles shift from side to side, and we estimate the translational speed of the vehicle by how rapidly these profiles change over time. And this is the end result. Sped up, of course, is 2 hours of mapping. And what we were able to do is create a topologically correct map of the entire environment. And at the time, this is the largest environment mapped by any visual SLAM system in the world. Oxford University came along a few years later and did 1,000 kilometers, but we had the record for a little bit. And this is the final map. And I can't remember which street it was, but we actually discovered at the time that Google Maps had missed part of a street section. We thought Google Maps was right and our map was wrong, but we went out and actually physically inspected it. And sure enough, there was actually a stretch of road that Google Maps didn't have on its map, but we did. So that was really cool. That was probably the last time we could compete with an organization as large as Google. And what's been really rewarding has been that there's been a large amount of follow-on work trying to look at SLAM systems inspired by all sorts of other animals, bat SLAM, dolphin SLAM, fish SLAM, and so on. If you do a SLAM paper and it has an animal name in it anywhere, it will get sent to me pretty much, just as a warning. But I love reading the research. So it took us over a decade to basically go from fundamental neuroscience to highly capable SLAM technology that was starting to be developed into applications in industry and other areas. So quite a long journey. Some related work in brief. This is just a slide. As a rough rule of thumb, each slide represents 1 person year's worth of research, but obviously there's a lot of variety. I had a visiting PhD student, Fang Wen, who did Neuroscience. Basically, we were looking at how to move from the 3-dimensional environments, so ground-based environments, that RatSLAM persisted in, to 4 degree of freedom, 5 degree of freedom, and 6 degree of freedom environments. And he was able to get a system working quite well, and it ended up winning an international competition, quite a prestigious one. I think there was, I can't remember how many entries, maybe 100 or 200 entries all up, and he got the grand prize, which was really impressive. We learned a lot about the neural representations required to do navigation in 6 degrees of freedom instead of 3 degrees of freedom. And Fang Wen tried a very large number of interesting alternative models. And that's work that has a lot of potential into the future. Marvin, a PhD student in my lab currently, did a system called FlyNet. So rather than using rats, we've modeled aspects of the neural circuits in the fly brain to create even more compact but high performance sort of localization or positioning systems for use in robotics. And as I said before, the publication references are all at the bottom of the slide, and I will send the slides out afterwards. We've done lots of work in biologically inspired sensing. Event cameras are cameras, this is a video at the top left, that show, basically detect change in intensity. So it's sort of not a motion sensor, but you can think of it that way. And so I started off doing some work when I was at Imperial College London on sabbatical, and Toby Fischer, a postdoc in my lab, has continued this work on as well. And we have some nice new results there. A lot of work in low light cameras. We know that some animals, like certain types of moths, can see very well in the dark, apparently. So we've been working in that space. UV sensitive cameras, with the University of Edinburgh leading this work, looking at how we can model aspects of vision in ants. So some ants can see, they have eyes, and they have UV sensitive vision. And that enables all sorts of neat tricks. And finally, this is work led by ANU that we collaborated on, stereo polarized cameras. So polarization of vision is a big thing for animals like bees. And in autonomous vehicles, for example, you could use it to detect water hazards on the road, or even perhaps black ice on the road. So lots of potential applications there. We've also looked a lot at these multi-scale representations, the grid cells in the brain, this discovery that got Moses the Nobel Prize. And we've been doing lots of work investigating, I guess, the functional advantages of having these multi-scale representations. So starting many years ago, but leading up to the current day and beyond, including work by former students of mine like Zitao and current students of mine like Stephen at the bottom right, and resulting in a number of papers. That's also another untapped area of investigation, and I could easily spend 20 or 30 years just investigating that. And we've also been translating it sort of into more applied contexts. So this is a project funded by the Asian Office of the Asian Office of the US Air Force. And we were looking at how we could create ultra compact, ultra scalable mapping systems, modeling these grid cells. And this was much more successful than we thought it would be when we started. We thought there was a high chance of failure. And so that was another example of how you can go from biological inspiration to something that might have practical benefits. This is work done by Jacob Bruce, while he was at DeepMind, or actually in conjunction with Google DeepMind, basically looking at how, rather than manually encoding all of these systems, how we can sort of learn them from, or nearly from scratch. So the idea here was we drove a robot around much of our campus, so a very ambitious sort of data set. Jake reconstructed a virtual environment using all of that data, and he was able to train or do reinforcement learning very effectively by using that single traverse of the environment. So you didn't actually have to use a robot doing the learning live. You could replay the data in all sorts of creative ways. Now, replaying a single data set is not very effective, so you have to do all sorts of augmentations. So Jake did all these augmentations, like when the robot looked up an image, it would sometimes get served an image from a nearby place rather than the place it was at. There was randomization of the consequences of the robot's actions. So if the robot decided to move forward, most of the time it would move forward, but sometimes it would just be served the same image as it had before. So it was made a lot more random, and all of these sort of interventions meant that the system was able to learn a generalized strategy for how to autonomously navigate. The other thing Jake did, which is quite common, I guess, is there was a stage curriculum of learning. So this robot was not trying to learn how to navigate from one end of the campus to the other. It was doing this in stages. So it would learn how to navigate a few meters at first, and then the difficulty level would gradually be ramped up as it became more competent. I should note for this experiment as well, Jake was taking high-level commands from the robot, or an experimenter was, and actually controlling the low-level motor commands of the robot. In a future work, you'd actually automate that part as well. So you can see the campus map that we mapped, and you can see some of the routes that the robot was able to navigate. It even dealt with elevators. One of the challenges with elevators is they're destination specific. So Jake coded in specific actions for the target destination floors. Otherwise, you might get a painful situation where the robot decided to stop at every floor, which would have annoyed the other humans trying to use the lift to get somewhere. All right, I'm just looking at time. I think I'm going all right for time. I'll try and stick to time as well, because we've all got other stuff to do. So what happens when the world changes? So all of the work that I've presented today was what I'd say occurred under conditions that I'd say are relatively ideal. One of the things that did occur to us in many of these experiments was the world is never as nice as we'd hope it to be, at least as roboticists. This is just an example from some of our local roads of how much the world's appearance changes from day to night, and from clear weather to the middle of a thunderstorm. In a Northern Hemisphere environment, this might be snow, but the environment is always changing radically in its appearance. And it's a challenging problem. When we started attacking this problem, I did up this diagram. So the places in the left column, so the two images at the left column, they're the same place in the world under very different conditions. And obviously they superficially look really, really different. The images in the middle column are from completely different places in the world, but they look very similar. So our challenge was to design a system that could match the places on the left without matching the places in the middle. Excuse me. And this plays to the general challenges that robots face. The first is appearance change. The world's always changing in appearance. The second is viewpoint change. When you're moving around, what you're looking at can be seen from many different perspectives, and its appearance can also change depending on those perspectives, which is another problem. And when you combine these together, you get a pathologically difficult problem. And this has been the underlying problem that's motivated so much of our research in our group. We've attacked it from a lot of different angles. I won't talk about most of these today. Novel sensing methods, bio-inspired techniques, the big hammer of deep learning, of course. You should always beat something over the head with deep learning whenever you can. novel algorithms, semantics, so a richer understanding of the world, and using simulation extensively as well. I'll talk about one of these approaches first, which is called SeqSLAM. So when we started attacking this problem, the majority of, I guess, what you call localization or positioning systems, they would attempt to take the current image from the camera on the robot or the vehicle and try and find the best match for that image throughout the entire environment. So what we did with SeqSLAM was, rather than saying we're just going to try to find the best match, we forced the system to find hundreds or thousands or millions of speculative matches such that every part of the environment had a theoretical match, no matter how ridiculous. And then what we did is, over time, because a vehicle or a robot moves through the environment, we found spatially and temporally coherent sequences of these highly speculative matches. It really boils down to about 5 lines of code. That was probably why it got rejected from the computer vision conference we submitted it to first. But then it won the best paper award, best vision paper award at ICRA, the robotics conference, the next year when we submitted it unchanged. And so with this approach, we could localize in 300-meter long sequences of data. So we needed to integrate information over 300 meters. So not super practical, but still a great start, because you just couldn't have done this before this stage, not with vision at least. And you could do all sorts of other neat things. We had a year or two where we just had lots of fun. So at the time, you couldn't get cameras that worked very well at night, but you could get cameras where you could open the shutter for a long duration, so multiple seconds. When you do that, you get very blurry images, but you do get enough light into the camera to actually make out the scene. That meant you could do navigation and mapping using this system, at least in road-like environments, in almost pitch blackness, which is really cool. You could also do very efficient mapping and navigation. So this is a data set we did. Oxford and our group have been friendly competitors for many, many years. The image at the bottom left is a 2 megapixel image from one of their autonomous car data sets. And the image at the top left is an image containing enough data for our system at the time to beat all of the other systems at over about 130 kilometers of car and indoor data sets. So 2 megapixels worth of data was all you needed to do to achieve state-of-the-art performance over a very large amount of environment. Doesn't work for a drone freely maneuvering, but was very applicable for robots or vehicles in path-like environments. This, of course, was of interest to insect groups, and so the University of Edinburgh did some work building on this system, and then we also did some subsequent work, as I mentioned before, with them as well, because insects obviously have small brains, so compact, simple systems are appealing. One of the things we wanted to do was get the sequence length down below 300 meters. So Ed, a former PhD student of mine, what he did was he introduced the use of motion information. So many systems like cars, you get motion information about roughly how fast you're going from encoders on the wheels, for example. And with this information, you can do things like constrain the search space when you're matching these sequences of places. And we were able to get the matching sequence length down to about 10 meters, which is a big improvement over 300 meters. And you can see an example of this in action. So what this is showing is a vehicle matching where it is across day-night cycles. And it was also able to do this across the median strip. So even if the car was driving down the opposite side of the road under completely different conditions, it was able to visually recognize where it was. Sometimes you don't want to wait 10 meters though. Sometimes you need your vehicle or your robot to localize or know where it is instantaneously. So this is work I did on sabbatical when I was over at Harvard with some neuroscientists and computer scientists there. What we did is we re-engineered some of our previous navigation systems to, at a very, very abstract level, model this hierarchical visual processing, visual processing done in animals like the primate brain. And one of the beauties of this system is that it balances selectivity and tolerance. So early on in the visual processing pathway, it's highly selective and highly tolerant. So highly selective means it might recognize a very specific, it's not very selective and not very tolerant early on. So it would recognize a four-legged animal, and it's not very tolerant of perturbation. So if the animal is in the dark or it's a long way away, you might not recognize it because of the scale change or the appearance change. Further down the visual processing pipeline, you become increasingly selective and increasingly tolerant. So you might recognize a much more specific object or thing, but you can recognize it even if you can only see a quarter of it. That's obviously a gross oversimplification, but we took these broad concepts, and with it, we were able to get a system that could work out that the places on the right here are actually not the same place in the world, despite them looking very similar. So we're basically able to replicate the SeqSLAM system, but without using sequences, which is really cool. Just checking. All right. And finally, in this tract of work, this is work done by my current postdoc, but this was done when he was a PhD student, on really pushing the boundaries of how we can recognize where we are in the world under the most extreme of circumstances. So to up the difficulty level, what we did is we took on the challenge of recognizing a roadway when you're driving down it under completely different conditions, so day to night, and driving down it in the completely opposite direction. And this is challenging because you only have a small amount of the field of view is commonly observable from both directions, and everything looks different because of a day-night cycle. Now, if you're a self-driving car company, you don't need to solve this. You just use a sensor, a camera, or a LiDAR with a 360-degree field of view, and it sees both backward and forward at the same time. But because we're doing research and we're also interested in aspects of how humans do this, this is a problem we took on. And the appeal of it is that we, as humans, we don't walk around with a 360-degree laser sensor on our head, and we don't walk around with a 360-degree camera, and we're not continually looking in our rear view mirror to work out where we are. We use all sorts of other tactics. So the approach, and this is a proper sort of modern machine learning type approach, was we'd take an image, we'd perform dense semantic segmentation, we'd get a number of classes. For this work, we only took 3 types of classes. I think it was something like vegetation and 2 others. And then we'd extract descriptors for each pixel in each semantic class. Within a local region, so within a local stretch of road, what we do is we extract the mean tensors of within each semantic region. And then for each image that we're processing, we calculate the mean absolute deviation. So we look at how far away the descriptors for each class in that particular image are from the norms that you'd expect. And that leaves you with what we'd call a local semantic tensor. Basically, all it is a signature for what the image looks like. And then we can use standard vector comparison techniques to come up with a ranked list of where do we think we are most likely in the environment. Now, because the problem is so notoriously difficult, we then had to find a way to further validate and evaluate that ranked list of match hypotheses. So what we did is we took the feature maps in the Con5 layer of this network. We looked at the maximally activated components of these feature maps, and we treated them as pseudo or hypothetical key points. So key points are the matching points between the pair of images. This method was also very noisy just because the problem was so difficult. So finally, we had a verification process whereby we checked that proposed key point pairs were both in the same semantic class. So they both belong to, say, the vegetation class. And then we also weighted the key point matches by their distance in image space. If you put that all together, we get a system that's able to match these places as being the same places in the world, despite the fact they're in completely opposite directions and despite the huge degree of appearance change. And once again, as far as we know, this is a first in the field. We expanded this so we could do it across lanes of a highway as well, so even more challenging. And then Surav also added in, with collaboration with Monash University, added in depth information as well to further improve processes like this. All right, I'm doing actually quite all right for time. That's good. I didn't actually time this. So I'm actually not going to talk about any of these application areas, although I'd be happy to talk about them in questions or offline. But one of the things I've really enjoyed doing is translating some of the stuff we've been developing into projects with a large range of industry and government organizations, as well as research projects, but in applied areas like medical robotics would be a new project that we're just starting up. Some of these projects are finished, some of them are in process, and some of them are just starting. So what are the key takeaways from, I guess, this work that we've been doing? First of all, this is just a tiny taster of what we're doing, and at a very high level. I realize some people probably would have liked more detail on just one topic, but hopefully this gives an idea of what we could talk about next time, whenever that be, or offline. One of the things we've learned going from fundamentally a biologically inspired approach to deployment is that you still use a lot of conventional sort of algorithmic based approaches, some of them 10, 20, 30 years old. They end up in almost any deployable system inevitably. The biologically inspired components are usually only a small fraction of the system, and often the biological inspiration is different to how you expected it. So for a lot of the SeqSLAM work, although we were doing neural models of navigation circuits in the rat brain, it was actually the fact that we showed that you could use quite low resolution images and still have really good performance. That was actually the more influential component of that work. In many respects. It also taught us a lot about probabilistic filtering as well, so you can never really predict how the research will shape further outcomes. And finally, yes, we found that we do have to use modern deep learning based approaches, especially for things like learnt visual features, but they only form, once again, a subcomponent of the final system. And the combinations, the weightings of these three components varies hugely depending on the domain. And the sort of things that affect this balance are sensor differences. So the sensors that animals have are not the same as the sensors that our robots have. Excuse me. So it's not all one-way traffic either. So humans have a superb sense of vision, which is only starting to be matched by artificial systems. Autonomous cars have amazing range sensors that detect ranges up to 200 meters away down to like a centimeter's accuracy. And biology, apart from animals like bats, they just don't have that. So you obviously will get discrepancies in a system deployed in an engineering context with the original animal that it was based on. There's embodiment differences. Robots are fragile, they're heavy, they break, and if they fall on someone, they can kill them. Animals physically are just made to be robust. Flies and birds can bounce off things without injuring themselves, in stark contrast to most drones, for example. So embodiment differences are also a main point of, main reason for the differentiation. Different risk appetites. Nature doesn't really care if every single animal makes it, whereas if you have an autonomous vehicle, you better make sure it is 99.99999% reliable. Performance ceilings. So a lot of the performance ceilings come to deep learning, right? You can do things with deep learning based techniques that you just can't do with the traditional or bio-inspired techniques. So sometimes you are forced to use deep learning just because you won't hit the performance that you would otherwise need. And provability. So provability is great with conventional approaches, traditional control, for example. Modern deep learning based methods and even some bio-inspired methods, they're a little hard to prove. So moving forward, I guess my group and my interests, we're really interested in combining these and working out better ways to combine them and to work out how they should be combined, depending on task and domain specific requirements, I guess. And that's an area of ongoing interest. And I guess in the big picture, what's really interesting us, and if people are interested in sort of thinking about bigger, longer term initiatives in this area, please reach out. Really interested in machines and minds working better together. It sounds like a grandiose title, but really it's taking what we know about artificial intelligence, what we know about neuroscience, what we know about animals and human behavior, and what we know about the fact that most things are not going to be fully automated. It's going to be humans and automation and AI working synergistically together. And that is super, super fascinating and something that we're really looking to push at a sort of strategic level. We're hiring, shameless plug, we always have positions available. This is QUT, please hit us up. We're always interested in collaboration. We are a very collaborative group. We have, I think, over 100 collaborations with organizations and companies all around the world. And there's a huge range of manners in which collaboration can take place. Good. I can have a drink while I wait for questions. Thanks, Iman. Thanks. Thanks for coming too to the seminar.
Thanks, Michael. So we can take a couple of questions if there are any questions for Michael. Daniel, go ahead.
Hi, Michael. Thanks. That was a fascinating talk. I've got a question about the start of your talk. So you talked about different kinds of cells,
Yes.
like grid cells or cells that code position or orientation in a rat's brain.
Yep.
How do you represent that mathematically? Like, what's your mathematical representation for a pose cell? And how does that relate to what's actually happening in a rat, for example?
Sure. All right. I have 2 hours left, right, Iman?
Yes, take as much as you want the next day. Yeah, go ahead.
Look, that's a great question, and I deliberately glossed over those details, but I can try and give you a sort of 1 or 2 minute summary. So there's the way we did it, and then there's the ways that other people are doing it as well. So the way we did it is we had a rate-coded neural network, rate-coded continuous attractor neural network. That means that each neuron or unit in that network just has an activity level between 0 and 1. So it's not a spiking neuron. It's not a more sophisticated sort of Hodgkin-Huxley model of a neuron. It's just got a value between 0 and 1. The topological...
Sorry, can I just interrupt you for a second? When you talk about neural networks, do you mean like the biological neural networks or the machine learning structure?
Sorry, I'm talking about the artificial one. Is that what
Right.
you want to know about, the artificial one or the ones in nature?
How they relate, really, but yeah.
Okay, so we don't know everything about the ones in nature, right? We know that if you put probes in there, you'll get a bunch of different cells that have strong spatial properties. We don't know the exact connectivity of these networks, both to other areas of the brain, but also within them. We don't know exactly what the intra connectivity of each of these spatial networks is. We just know their broad properties. So it's not completely known. As I was saying, the way we modeled it was we used rate-coded, so 0 to 1 value continuous attractor networks. And most importantly, what we did was the topographical or topological structure of the network was laid out to initially roughly represent the layout of space. As you deployed the system in an actual environment, the coherency or the correlation between the structural layout of the network and the structural layout of space got weaker and weaker, but that was how it initially started. If you look at some of the recent work, so Google DeepMind did, I think, a paper in Nature of Science in 2018, where they basically learnt grid-like properties from scratch by imposing a whole bunch of navigational constraints. So that's, I guess, a sort of learning from scratch approach to generating grid-like models. And then there are people who've done, there's a lot of interest in spiking neural models. So spiking neural models aren't just rate coded. The values of the cell isn't just between 0 and 1. There's still a long way from detailed anatomical models of cells, which are also done, but they're sort of interesting, especially with the rise of neuromorphic hardware that may offer potential computing advantages. That's a woefully insufficient answer to your question, but hopefully it gives you a taster of how we did it and what is in nature.
Yeah, so sorry, just to clarify. So if I was to think of it, would I think of, say, a graph with the nodes and each node has a value between 0 and 1?
You could think of it as a fully interconnected graph, sure. I guess just to avoid any confusion, we have a graph map in our RATSLAM system, which is completely separate to the neural network. It's called the experience map, but it's just a graphical map. That itself is not a neural network.
All right. Maybe I have more questions, but maybe we should take it offline.
Okay, sure. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Daniel. Ian, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Very interesting talk. I just had, when you showed the figure of the grid cells, the biologically recorded ones, and it had almost like periodic firing patterns at different spatial scales.
Yes.
It almost looked like a binary encoding of the space. Have people actually been able to decode if you saw a particular pattern, it would be a particular place from these?
Yes. Yeah. So because there's in the mouse or rat brain, there's hundreds of thousands of cells in these areas of the brain, which could potentially be grid cells. And they're obviously only recording from a few hundred, maybe 1,000 at a time. So they only have very limited observability. But people have been able to do all sorts of cool decoding. So they've been able to decode where the rat thinks it is in the environment. That's sort of been the foundational thing. But they've also been able to do cool things like decode where the rat is planning to go. So if you look it up, there's these awesome videos showing a rat or a mouse thinking about its path through a maze and the actual firing patterns moving through its representation of the maze. So they have some ability to decode these. The spatial and temporal resolution is relatively crude, but it's a good start.
Is the I mean, if you think about a binary encoding being kind of a multi-scale encoding of something, is that thought to be useful for path planning? Because you can kind of go down the
Yep, definitely. So we've done, and a number of other groups have done, all sorts of short and long-term path planning research. And yes, the multi-scale representation is great for that. It's also got all sorts of nice theoretical properties for noise rejection as well. And there's a number of researchers, our lab, but also Lafitte's lab. I can send you these afterwards. Mathematicians have been entranced by these ever since they were discovered. The main problem that we face as roboticists is that a lot of the theoretical, really attractive properties of the grid cells are completely become irrelevant when you deploy them in a real robot system with noise and things like loop closure problems and stuff like that. So there's still a lot of work to sort of bridge that divide between the theoretically appealing properties of them and how much of that you can actually instantiate on a robot in a real world environment.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I have a question, but I will ask it later because we are getting to 2 p.m. and all of us probably have other things to do. Let's just thank Michael again and everyone for attending. We will continue the talks from next week again, hopefully. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.